Hello and welcome to TraceCloud. In this video, we focus on traceability, and this is essentially the core of what TraceCloud does and how it brings value. This shows you how you can connect your work with the work being done by other people, either upstream or downstream, and how you can manage the change in the project as the project evolves. So I will start with the TraceCloud demo project. And what I have done in some of the previous videos was to import some requirements into this folder. At this point, these requirements in this folder are kind of standalone requirements. They are here. I can edit them, I can modify them, I can keep track of all the changes that are happening. I can define attributes, I can attach files. But this work in this folder is being done in isolation. That means it is not connected to any other work that's happening in the project. And this connection process in TraceCloud is called traceability. And this is how it's done. At different levels, let's say I'm at business requirements, I could say I want to connect these requirements and I'm going to create traces where I want to connect this to, say, my upstream objects called my release objects. Okay. Now, if you don't have any upstreams, it's as simple as going back to your folder here, pick what your upstream systems are, and then go and create an object here. Okay, so let's say I call this my demo of traceability, if I can type that right. Okay, I have created an object. It's called release 48. At this point, this doesn't have any downstream work that's happening. So I could choose to go to my business requirements that I have in this folder and say, well, see this requirement? I want to connect this to that release that is tracking all the work. So I could say, well, let me go to my release folder, and the one that I have that I just created called demo of traceability, I will go ahead and connect this business requirement to that. At this point, I have connected one requirement to another, and the relationship between this business requirement I'm in right now and the release object is considered, I would say, clear or kosher, right? It's green, everything is good. Later on, I could, as I define my functional requirements, I could choose to go here and say, well, let me connect my business requirement to my functional requirements. And I could say, well, see this functional requirement, this should trace up to my business requirement. And this functional requirement also should trace up. And this one should also trace up. Okay. Now, if I go here and see my relationship, you could see this release has one business requirement in it, which has three functional requirements in it. And all the relationships are green, everything is looking good. However, if for some reason halfway through the project, I were to go and modify this business requirement, should not be able to. The previous world, when I have this requirement, I've modified it. You could see that my version number has gone up by one. If I were to go here, I can go and see what the previous versions look like. I have a change log, everything is looking good. But because I have traceability enabled, anybody who is looking at this functional requirement, right, they should be able to say, this functional requirement existed to solve a lot of business requirements, and the relationship between this functional requirement and everything is good, except this business requirement to which it was green some time ago has become red. And I, as the owner of the functional requirement, have visibility to the problem, and I have the option of going to the business requirement and seeing what happened, why it became red. And if I think it's not a big deal, I could work with the business requirement owner and choose to clear the suspect, right? And eventually, when all my upstream and downstream folks have cleared their work, then that essentially tells me that whatever change I made has been accepted by both my downstream and upstream folks. That is traceability. In just to summarize, typically you have requirements, you're working in isolation, but with traceability, what you can do is you can connect your work to people upstream and to the work downstream. And similarly, the people downstream can connect their work further down the stream. So what you have is this entire traceability chain that gets formed, so that when somebody modifies their requirements along the way, you pretty much have visibility as to whether this change propagated itself all the way across the traceability chain to the lowest level of objects. Now, it may look a little bit complicated, but there are lots of different tools. For example, in this case, you saw me doing it one requirement at a time, but later on in further videos, I'll show you how you can do this in bulk using other tools like a trace matrix or a trace tree or a regular report. But for the time being, know that when you have a requirement, you can connect it to other requirements, and the relationship initially is clear. But if somebody kind of modifies their requirement text, then you get visibility to the problem. Now, during this period, you probably have been wondering what these boxes are. So let me hide the description. You can actually see this. What these boxes are. You keep on seeing this all over. This, once you get used to this UI, it makes a lot of sense. Anytime you see an O, that means that that object is an orphan object. That means it doesn't have any upstream requirement that is driving it. D means dangling. That means there's no downstream work that is being done. And the way to think of this is you're working on a project, you got the business requirements, and you have an engineering team that's doing the functional requirements. For all the business requirements that don't have a functional requirement, they show up as a D, which is dangling. So visually, you can just eyeball this and say, oops, I got lots of requirements that nobody's working on. When this project is done, they will not get implemented. Similarly, when you see an O, that means you have a lot of business requirements that aren't necessarily pointing upstream to anything. So you probably have orphan work that's being done. So that concept kind of carries over everywhere. For example, I can go to folder metrics and identify how many of my requirements are either dangling or orphan in this folder, how many have a suspect upstream, how many have a suspect downstream. Or if you have requirement ownership turned on, where every requirement has an owner, then every team member in your team could simply go and look at my status, and this my traceability tab tells you of the requirements that that person owns, how many are in a dangling status, how many are in orphan status, and how many have suspect upstream and downstream. So in a project that's running well, these numbers should all be zero. If it's not zero, that means there's change that's not being accepted everywhere, or the requirements that are not being implemented everywhere. So that's a quick overview of what requirements traceability is. In additional videos, I'll show you how to deal with traceability in bulk, because you really can't modify one requirement at a time. There are times when you want to modify hundreds of requirements at a time, and I'll show you the tools that are available to pull that off. Hope that helps.